Sarah Martinez thought it was just another late night at the community center finishing her volunteer work with at-risk youth. The 28-year-old social worker had been running a self-defense program for teenage girls in downtown Phoenix for the past 3 years, never imagining she'd need those skills herself. As she walked across the dimly lit parking lot toward her Honda Civic at 11:47 p.m., her keys jingling softly in the desert air, she had no idea that in the next 2 minutes, 4 armed men would corner her between the concrete barriers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They saw an easy target, this woman in scrubs, alone and vulnerable. What they didn't know was that before Sarah became a social worker, she had spent 8 years as a Marine Force reconnaissance operator, with 3 tours in Afghanistan and specialized training in close-quarters combat. Tonight these predators would learn why her former teammates called her Ghost, and why some mistakes in life come with permanent consequences. The Sunrise Community Center sat in one of Phoenix's transitional neighborhoods, where gentrification hadn't quite reached but hope still flickered in programs like Sarah's. She'd chosen this location deliberately after leaving the military, wanting to make a difference in communities that reminded her of her own childhood in East LA. The center stayed open late on Thursdays for various support groups, but by midnight, Sarah was usually the last person to leave. She'd developed this routine over 3 years: finish her paperwork, lock up the youth center wing, walk the 100 yards to her car, and drive home to her small apartment in Tempe. It was predictable, safe, and exactly the kind of peaceful routine she'd craved after years of combat deployments. The parking lot was a typical community center setup: TEPS, poorly lit with just 3 working streetlights, surrounded by a chain-link fence with multiple exit points. Budget constraints meant security cameras only covered the building entrances, leaving the parking area in relative darkness. Sarah had mentioned this to the center director multiple times, but funding for better lighting remained elusive. She'd learned to be extra vigilant during these late-night walks, though more from professional habit than genuine concern. Phoenix wasn't Baghdad, and her neighborhood, while not affluent, had been relatively quiet during her 3 years there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As she stepped out of the building's back exit, Sarah automatically scanned her surroundings, a habit drilled into her during military service that she'd never been able to shake. The parking lot appeared empty, except for her Honda Civic, positioned under one of the functioning streetlights, as was her custom. The October desert air carried the familiar sense of creosote and dust, with temperatures finally dropping from the day's heat into the comfortable 70s. She appreciated these quiet moments, the transition between her intense work with troubled youth and the solitude of her evening routine. Her backpack contained lesson plans for next week's self-defense classes, papers to grade from her part-time teaching at the community college, and a half-eaten sandwich she'd forgotten about during a particularly challenging group session with teenage mothers. The first sign something was wrong came as a subtle shift in the ambient sounds around her. Sarah's ears, trained to detect anomalies in hostile environments, picked up on the absence of normal nighttime noises. No distant traffic hum from the main street, no settling sounds from the building behind her. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that preceded trouble. Her hand instinctively moved toward her keychain, where she kept a small LED flashlight, and legally concealed, a compact knife she'd carried since her military days. These weren't paranoid precautions but practical tools that had become second nature during her transition to civilian life. 3 years of working in challenging neighborhoods had given Sarah a different kind of situational awareness than her military training. She'd learned to read the social dynamics of urban environments, understanding how poverty, desperation, and opportunity created volatile situations. The community center served families from across the socio-economic spectrum, but its location meant that predators sometimes saw it as a hunting ground. A place where good-hearted volunteers might let their guard down. Sarah had briefed the other staff members about basic security protocols, but she'd never felt personally threatened until tonight. As she approached her car, keys now firmly in hand with the largest key, positioned between her knuckles in a makeshift weapon configuration, Sarah noticed subtle indicators that made her military training kick into high alert. Fresh cigarette butts scattered near her car that hadn't been there when she'd parked. Disturbed gravel patterns suggesting recent foot traffic. The faint sound of whispered conversation coming from behind the dumpster near the fence line. Her civilian mind wanted to dismiss these observations as overthinking, but her combat experience recognized the signs of an impending ambush. Someone had been waiting, watching, and preparing. The irony wasn't lost on her that after surviving 8 years of military service, including firefights in Helmand Province and counterinsurgency operations in hostile territories, she might face her greatest danger in a community center parking lot in America. But Sarah had learned long ago that threats could emerge anywhere, and that preparation and training were the best defenses against becoming a victim. As she slowed her pace slightly, buying time to assess the situation more thoroughly, she began mentally running through her options and preparing for what she increasingly suspected was about to become a very dangerous encounter. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m., and the security guard wasn't scheduled to begin his rounds until midnight. Help was at least 15 minutes away, assuming she could even call for it. Sarah Martinez was about to face a test that would require every skill she'd learned in both her military and civilian lives. The four men emerged from the shadows with the coordinated movement of a pack that had done this before. Sarah's trained eyes immediately cataloged the threat assessment as they spread into a loose semicircle, cutting off her direct path to the car while leaving themselves room to maneuver. The leader, a tall man with prison tattoos crawling up his neck, positioned himself directly between Sarah and her Honda Civic. His three companions, two stocky men, who moved with the swagger of career criminals, and a younger, nervous-looking kid, who kept glancing toward the street, took flanking positions that demonstrated tactical awareness beyond typical street crime. Well, what do we have here?" the leader called out, his voice carrying the particular brand of mock friendliness that predators use to control situations. His accent suggested local origins, probably Phoenix-born and raised, with the kind of street sophistication that came from years of successful criminal activity. Sarah noted the bulge in his jacket pocket, likely a knife or small firearm, and the way he held his left shoulder slightly forward, suggesting he was left-handed and keeping his dominant hand free for quick action. These weren't desperate addicts looking for purse money, these were experienced predators who'd chosen their target deliberately. Sarah maintained her measured pace toward her car, neither speeding up in a way that would signal panic, nor slowing down enough to appear compliant. Her military training had taught her that the first few seconds of any confrontation often determined the ultimate outcome, and she needed to project calm confidence while rapidly processing tactical options. The parking lot's layout worked against her. Open ground with limited cover, multiple attackers with superior positioning, and no immediate escape routes that wouldn't expose her back to potential weapons fire. "Hey lady, we're talking to you," the second man chimed in, his voice more aggressive than the leader's performative courtesy. He was shorter but broader, with the kind of upper body mass that suggested either dedicated gym time or prison calisthenics. Sarah recognized the dynamic. The leader maintained psychological control while the enforcer provided physical intimidation. The third man, silent so far, kept checking their 6 o'clock, indicating they'd planned this encounter with some sophistication. The youngest member of their group appeared increasingly agitated, suggesting he might be unpredictable or potentially sympathetic if things went sideways. "I don't want any trouble," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying just enough volume to potentially be heard by any late-night security or maintenance staff. She continued walking toward her car, while simultaneously calculating angles and distances. 23 feet to the Honda Civic, 15 feet to the nearest concrete barrier that could provide cover. 37 feet to the building's back entrance, but that would require turning her back on 4 potential weapons. The chain-link fence offered multiple exit points but also potential choke points where she could be cornered more completely. The leader laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor that sent chills down most victims' spines but only served to confirm Sarah's tactical assessment. "Trouble? We're not trouble, sweetheart, we're opportunity. You work here, right? Probably got access to cash, maybe some valuable equipment inside that building. All we need is your cooperation, and everyone goes home happy." His tone carried the implicit threat that non-cooperation would result in something significantly less pleasant than going home happy. Sarah recognized the setup cues. They wanted her to unlock the community center, probably figuring that someone working late might have administrative access to offices containing petty cash, computers, or other resaleable items. The building did contain several $1,000s worth of equipment for the various programs, plus whatever money might be stored in the main office safe. It was actually a reasonably intelligent criminal plan, targeting someone who would have both access and motivation to comply under duress. Unfortunately for them, they'd chosen perhaps the one community center volunteer in Phoenix least likely to cooperate with armed intimidation. "I don't have keys to the building," Sarah lied smoothly, her hand moving slowly toward her pocket in a movement that could be interpreted as reaching for keys or identification. "I just volunteer with the youth programs. The doors lock automatically when I leave, and only the director has access codes." This was technically true. While Sarah did have emergency access, her primary keychain only contained classroom keys and her personal items. More importantly, it established her as a less valuable target while buying time to continue her tactical assessment. The third man finally spoke up, his voice carrying a hint of an accent that suggested recent immigration status. "She's lying. Look at her. This works late, knows the building, probably has master keys or at least knows where they keep the good stuff." His observation was actually quite astute. Sarah did present as someone with significant responsibility at the center. Her professional demeanor, the fact that she was leaving last, and her obvious familiarity with the facility all suggested administrative authority. "Let's find out," the leader said, pulling what Sarah now confirmed was a folding knife from his jacket. The blade length appeared to be about 4 inches long, enough to be lethal but short enough to be concealed easily. "Walk back to that door nice and slow. We're going to test just how much access you really have." The psychological pressure was expertly applied. Comply with a seemingly small request that would lead to increasingly dangerous compliance or face immediate physical threat. Sarah stopped walking toward her car, appearing to consider her options while actually finalizing her tactical plan. 4 opponents, weapons likely but not confirmed on all of them, superior positioning, but overconfident due to perceived advantage. The leader's knife was now visible, which actually improved her situation by confirming the immediate threat level and giving her legal justification for whatever response became necessary. More importantly, their demand that she return to the building would require them to move, potentially disrupting their coordinated positioning. "Okay," she said, raising her hands slightly in apparent surrender, while keeping them in ready positions for explosive movement. "Okay, let me just put my keys away properly so I don't drop them." The submission seemed to relax the group slightly, their first tactical mistake of the evening. As Sarah slowly reached toward her pocket, she watched the 4 men settle into the false confidence that came with apparent victory. The leader's knife remained visible, but his grip relaxed slightly, while his companions began to position themselves for the walk back to the building. This was the critical psychological moment that Sarah recognized from countless military briefings, the point where predators believed they'd established control and their attention shifted from immediate threat management to tactical execution of their plan. "Smart girl," the leader said approvingly, clearly enjoying the power dynamic he believed he'd established. "See how easy this is when everyone cooperates. We go inside, you show us where the valuable stuff is kept, we take what we came for, and you go home with a story to tell your friends. No one gets hurt, no one calls the cops, everyone wins." His tone carried the patronizing satisfaction of someone accustomed to intimidating victims into compliance through a combination of threatened violence and false promises of safety. Sarah nodded slowly, allowing her shoulders to slump slightly in apparent defeat while actually settling into a more stable base for explosive movement. "I understand, I just don't want anyone to get hurt." Her voice carried just the right note of fearful cooperation, confirming their assumptions about her psychological state while masking the tactical calculations running through her mind. The leader's body language showed he was completely buying her performance, another critical error in what was about to become a very expensive lesson in target selection. The second man, Apparently the group's enforcer moved closer to Sarah's left side while maintaining what he probably considered a safe distance. Yeah, we're reasonable people, this doesn't have to be complicated. His positioning revealed another tactical mistake. He was close enough to grab her if she ran toward the car, but too far away to stop explosive movement toward him. Military training had taught Sarah that most civilian criminals, even experienced ones, thought in terms of controlling escape routes rather than preventing counterattacks. Jimmy, check the perimeter. The leader instructed the youngest member of their group, sending him toward the parking lot entrance to watch for approaching vehicles or pedestrians. This reduced their numbers from 4 to 3 active threats while removing what Sarah assessed as their most unpredictable variable. Jimmy appeared nervous enough that he might freeze or flee if violence erupted, but his removal from the immediate tactical situation simplified her calculations considerably. The third man, who'd been mostly silent, moved to Sarah's right side, but maintained greater distance than his partner. His positioning suggested either greater tactical awareness or natural caution, but it also indicated that he might be less committed to the confrontation than the others. Sarah filed this observation away as potentially useful in a multiple attacker situation. Identifying the least committed opponent could provide strategic advantages if she could eliminate or neutralize the primary threats. So what exactly are you looking for inside? Sarah asked, appearing to make conversation while actually gathering intelligence about their objectives and timeline. I mean, the center doesn't keep much money on site. Most of our funding comes through electronic transfers, and the equipment is mostly donated stuff that's not worth much on the resale market. This was another tactical probe, designed to gauge their knowledge of the facility and their sophistication as criminals. The leader's response revealed both their preparation level and their fundamental misunderstanding of community center. Don't play stupid with us. We know there's computers, maybe some cash from programs, probably donations that haven't been deposited yet, plus whatever's in that main office safe. Don't think we haven't done our homework. Their intelligence was partially accurate, but revealed gaps that Sarah could potentially exploit. They knew enough to be dangerous but not enough to anticipate the complications they were about to encounter. As they began moving toward the building, Sarah maintained her submissive posture while conducting a more detailed threat assessment. The leader remained focused on psychological control, which meant his attention was divided between monitoring her compliance and planning their next steps. The enforcer appeared comfortable with potential violence but was operating on assumptions about her capabilities that were about to prove catastrophically incorrect. The third man seemed more cautious but also more observant, potentially making him the most dangerous opponent. Despite his current reserve, you know, I've been working here for 3 years and I've never had anything like this happen, Sarah said conversationally, projecting nervous chatter while actually, usually the parking lot is pretty safe, even late at night. Are you guys from around? The question served multiple purposes. It kept them talking and potentially revealed information about their local knowledge while maintaining her cover. As a frightened victim, making desperate small talk. Yeah, we know the area, the leader replied vaguely, clearly not interested in providing information that could later identify. Just keep walking and keep quiet. The sooner we get inside, the sooner this is over. His impatience was beginning to show, which Sarah recognized as another tactical advantage. Impatient criminals make mistakes, and mistakes in a situation like this could prove fatal for the people making them. The distance to the building was approximately 40 yards, giving Sarah time for final preparations while maintaining her psychological cover. Her keys remained in her hand, positioned for use as weapons if necessary. Her balance stayed centered, despite her apparent submission, ready for explosive movement in any direction. Most importantly, her mind had shifted fully into combat mode, while her external appearance continued to project victim compliance. This psychological disparity would prove crucial in the next phase of their encounter. As they approached the halfway point to the building, Sarah began implementing the most dangerous part of her plan.
The success or failure of the next 30 seconds would likely determine whether she walked away from this encounter or became another crime statistic in Phoenix police reports.
20 feet from the community center's back entrance, Sarah made her move with the calculated precision of someone trained to turn disadvantage into victory. The leader had relaxed his grip on the knife while fumbling for what she assumed was a flashlight to better navigate the building's darkened interior. His two active companions had settled into a loose formation that prioritized herding her toward the door rather than maintaining defensive positions against potential counterattack. It was exactly the tactical error she'd been waiting for. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, stopping in her tracks and causing the entire group to halt their forward momentum. "I think I hear something, maybe security making rounds early." She tilted her head as if listening intently, a gesture that appeared nervous but actually served to mask her transition into a combat stance. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, her breathing deepened slightly to oxygenate her muscles, and her hands adjusted their grip on her keys to maximize their effectiveness as improvised weapons. The leader's attention immediately shifted toward the building and parking lot, scanning for potential threats to their operation. This was the moment Sarah had been engineering since the encounter began. His focus diverted from controlling her to protecting himself, his weapon temporarily lowered, and his balance compromised by the sudden change in his attention. Military training had taught her that the transition between planned action and reactive response created critical vulnerabilities, even in experienced opponents. "I don't hear anything," the enforcer said, but his voice carried enough uncertainty to confirm that Sarah's deception had introduced doubt into their psychological control of the situation. He moved closer to her position, ostensibly to maintain physical intimidation but actually stepping into the striking range she'd been calculating since their first encounter. His greater mass would normally provide significant advantage in a physical confrontation, but his proximity eliminated his ability to react to explosive movement. The third man maintained his more cautious distance but also turned his attention towards scanning their surroundings, further fragmenting their coordinated awareness of Sarah's positioning and intentions. This divided attention represented the tactical opportunity she'd been creating through 3 minutes of apparent cooperation and submission. Against multiple attackers, success often depended on creating moments where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. "You're right, probably nothing," Sarah said, appearing to relax while actually coiling for explosive action. "I guess I'm just nervous. I've never been robbed before, and I keep thinking about what could go wrong." Her words served multiple purposes. They maintained her psychological cover, continued to fragment their attention through implied threats they needed to consider, and positioned her final statements before violence became inevitable. The leader turned back toward her with irritation beginning to override his earlier patience. "Look, lady, the sooner you stop wasting time with stupid questions and imaginary sounds, the sooner we're all done with this. Now move toward that door before I decide we don't need your cooperation to get inside." His growing impatience represented both increased danger and increased opportunity. Angry people made tactical mistakes, and mistakes against someone with Sarah's training could prove permanently costly. Okay, I'm sorry," Sarah replied, taking what appeared to be a submissive step forward while actually positioning herself for maximum leverage against the enforcer's position. Military training had drilled into her the critical importance of initiative in close-quarters combat. The person who moved first with decisive action usually controlled the entire engagement. After 3 minutes of psychological preparation, she was finally ready to test whether 4 career criminals were prepared for what happened when their carefully selected victim turned out to be a predator herself. The enforcer, emboldened by what he interpreted as her increased compliance, made the fatal error of reaching toward Sarah's arm to physically guide her toward the building. His movement brought him within striking distance while his attention focused on maintaining physical control rather than defending against attack. The leader's knife remained lowered as he prepared to lead them to the building entrance. The third man continued his perimeter scanning, convinced that external threats represented their primary concern. Sarah's military training had emphasized that successful close-quarters combat against multiple opponents required rapid elimination of the most dangerous threats while using positioning and timing to prevent coordinated responses. The leader's knife made him the primary threat, but his current positioning and divided attention created opportunity. The enforcer's physical proximity and aggressive positioning made him the most immediate tactical target. The third man's caution and distance meant he would likely require separate engagement after the initial phase of combat. As the enforcer's hand moved toward her arm, Sarah's appearance of submission evaporated like smoke in the desert wind. 8 years of Marine Force reconnaissance training, 3 combat tours, and countless hours of hand-to-hand combat instruction condensed into explosive action that would transform 4 confident predators into victims of their own catastrophic miscalculation. The quiet social worker was about to remind everyone present why her military callsign had been Ghost and why some mistakes in target selection carried permanent consequences. The next 5 seconds would redefine everyone's understanding of who was predator and who was prey in this Phoenix Community Center parking lot. Sarah's transition from apparent victim to deadly force was so explosively sudden that the enforcer never had time to register what was happening to him. Her left hand deflected his reaching arm, while her right drove the longest key on her ring into the soft tissue just below his ear, penetrating deep enough to reach vital structures while her body weight and forward momentum multiplied the force of impact. Military training had taught her that in close-quarters combat against multiple attackers, the first strike had to be immediately debilitating or potentially fatal. Wounding an opponent only guaranteed continued resistance when she needed rapid elimination. The enforcer's scream of pain and shock shattered the quiet night air as Sarah simultaneously drove her knee into his groin with sufficient force to lift his feet off the ground. His body's involuntary response to multiple trauma points caused him to double over directly into her rising elbow, which connected with his temple in a strike designed to cause immediate unconsciousness or worse. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and removed their most physically imposing threat from active combat status before his companions could process what they were witnessing. The leader's reaction time, slowed by shock and disbelief, gave Sarah the tactical window she needed to press her advantage against superior numbers. As the enforcer collapsed toward the asphalt, she was already pivoting toward the man with the knife, her movements flowing with the kind of lethal grace that came from years of training in environments where hesitation meant death. Her hands came up in a defensive posture that appeared protective but actually positioned her for immediate counterattack against blade weapons. "What the hell?" the leader began, his voice carrying the incredulous tone of someone whose worldview was being violently restructured. His knife hand came up defensively rather than aggressively, a tactical error that revealed his complete unpreparedness for armed resistance from his intended victim. Criminal predators typically selected targets based on perceived vulnerability, and their psychological preparation rarely included contingencies for encountering trained military opposition. Sarah didn't waste time on verbal responses or psychological warfare. Her military training had emphasized that combat communication was accomplished through action rather than words, and her actions were speaking with devastating clarity. She closed the distance to the leader in 3 rapid steps, staying low and moving at angles that made it difficult for him to track her movement or coordinate with his remaining companion. Her approach forced him to choose between backing away and losing initiative or standing ground and engaging in close combat he was clearly unprepared for. The third man, positioned to Sarah's right and slightly behind her initial position, finally began reaching for what appeared to be his own weapon while shouting warnings that came far too late to influence the tactical situation. "She's got Tony! She's got Tony!" His panic was understandable but tactically counterproductive, confirming Sarah's assessment that he was the least experienced member of their group and therefore likely to make additional errors under pressure. Sarah's attack on the leader utilized the kind of empty-hand techniques against blade weapons that most civilians never imagined possible. She stepped inside his knife arc while simultaneously controlling his weapon arm, using his forward momentum against him while delivering precise strikes to nerve clusters that caused immediate temporary paralysis in his dominant hand. The knife clattered to the asphalt as she drove him backward into the concrete barrier behind him, his head connecting with sufficient force to echo across the parking lot. The entire engagement from first contact to neutralizing 2 active threats had taken less than 10 seconds, leaving the third man still fumbling with whatever weapon he'd been attempting to deploy. Sarah's tactical assessment identified him as the least immediate threat, but also the most likely to successfully flee and potentially summon additional criminals or report her identity to law enforcement. Military training had taught her that incomplete neutralization of hostile forces often created more dangerous situations than initial encounters. "Stay down," she commanded the leader, who was currently held against the concrete barrier by her forearm across his throat while his knife lay several feet away on the asphalt. Her voice carried the kind of absolute authority that came from commanding Marines in combat situations, and it had the desired effect of freezing him in place despite his size advantage. The enforcer remained motionless where he'd fallen, either unconscious or pretending to be incapacitated while assessing his options. The third man had finally produced what appeared to be a small-caliber pistol, but his hands were shaking badly enough that accurate fire would be nearly impossible even at close range. "Let him go," he shouted, his voice cracking with stress and adrenaline. "Let him go, or I'll shoot." The threat was credible enough to require immediate tactical response, but his obvious inexperience with firearms under stress provided Sarah with several strategic options for neutralizing him without accepting unnecessary risk. Young Jimmy, positioned at the parking lot entrance as their lookout, had apparently heard the commotion and was running toward the fight with what looked like a tire iron in his hands. This meant Sarah now faced potential armed resistance from two directions while maintaining control of her primary captive. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly, but her training and experience provided frameworks for managing multiple armed opponents in close-quarters environments. The next phase of combat would test whether her 8 years of military training could overcome the numerical disadvantage and weapon superiority that her attackers still maintained. Sarah's assessment of the tactical situation crystallized in the space between heartbeats. The third man's pistol represented the most immediate lethal threat, but his obvious inexperience and deteriorating psychological state created exploitable opportunities. Jimmy's approach with the tire iron added time pressure but also predictability. His route and approximate arrival time were easy to calculate. Most importantly, her current position using the leader as a human shield provided both protection and leverage against the remaining threats. "You don't want to shoot," Sarah called out to the gunman, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone accustomed to high-stress negotiations. "Look at your partner here. Look at your friend on the ground. You think I got lucky twice?" Her psychological pressure was precisely calculated. ICE career criminals understood violence as a tool of intimidation, but they rarely encountered someone who wielded it with professional competence. Seeds of doubt about their assumptions were already visible in his increasingly erratic grip on the weapon. The leader struggled weakly against her hold, but Sarah's positioning and leverage made resistance largely ineffective. "Just shoot her, Marcus," he gasped, confirming both the gunman's name and his desperation. "She killed Tony." This wasn't accurate. The enforcer was still breathing, though probably concussed, but the leader's perception of the situation revealed how completely their expectations had been shattered. They'd planned for victim compliance, not military-grade combat resistance. Marcus's hands continued to shake as he tried to establish a clear shot that wouldn't endanger his leader, but Sarah's positioning and constant micro-movements made this increasingly impossible. "I can't get a clean angle," he replied, frustration and panic warring in his voice. Military training had taught Sarah that creating impossible tactical dilemmas for opponents often proved more effective than direct confrontation, particularly when dealing with less experienced adversaries. Jimmy was now within 30 yards of their position, close enough that Sarah could see his face clearly in the street light. His expression showed determination mixed with obvious fear. He's committed to helping his friends but clearly hadn't expected their simple robbery to evolve into a combat situation. This psychological conflict made him potentially more dangerous than Marcus, since desperate people often took risks that rational opponents would avoid. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah announced, tightening her control over the leader while addressing both remaining threats. "You're going to put that gun down, Marcus. Jimmy's going to drop the tire iron. Then you're all going to walk away and forget this ever happened. Because the alternative is that I demonstrate some of the more advanced techniques they taught me in Fallujah." The reference to Iraq combat operations was deliberate psychological warfare designed to introduce doubt about exactly what kind of opponent they'd chosen to target. "She's bluffing," the leader wheezed, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah's combat performance had already demonstrated capabilities that exceeded civilian self-defense training, and his street experience probably gave him enough tactical knowledge to recognize military-grade technique when he encountered it. The growing doubt in his voice confirmed that her psychological campaign was having the desired effect on group morale. Marcus took a step backward, his pistol wavering as conflicting impulses warred in his decision-making process. Shooting toward his leader carried obvious risks, but allowing Sarah to maintain control would likely result in law enforcement involvement and potential identification of their entire group. Jimmy's continued approach meant the tactical situation would change dramatically within the next 15 seconds, forcing decisions that would have permanent consequences for everyone involved. The enforcer chose that moment to stir on the asphalt, groaning softly as consciousness began returning. Sarah immediately reassessed her tactical position. If Tony regained combat effectiveness, she'd face potential attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Her current advantages in positioning and psychological control could evaporate rapidly if her opponents coordinated their responses effectively. "Last chance, Marcus," Sarah said, allowing steel to enter her voice. "Look around, look at what happened to your friends. Ask yourself if you really want to find out what happens next." Military training had emphasized that psychological victory often preceded physical victory, and that forcing opponents to confront the logical consequences of their choices could prevent unnecessary escalation of violence. Jimmy reached the 15-yard line, close enough now that Sarah could see individual features clearly. His grip on the tire iron appeared firm, suggesting commitment to using it, but his approach path remained predictable enough that she could plan defensive responses. The convergence of multiple threats was reaching critical mass, requiring immediate action to prevent losing tactical control of the situation. Marcus made his decision, beginning to lower the pistol while taking another step backward. "This is insane," he muttered, apparently concluding that discretion offered better survival odds than continued confrontation. His psychological surrender represented a tactical victory, but Jimmy's continued approach meant the immediate danger hadn't diminished substantially. "Jimmy, stop," Marcus called out, recognizing the same tactical realities that Sarah had been calculating. "Just stop, man. This isn't what we signed up for." The breakdown in group cohesion was accelerating, providing Sarah with the strategic advantage she'd been working to achieve since the encounter began. Jimmy's forward momentum faltered as Marcus's command penetrated his adrenaline-fueled charge, creating the tactical pause that Sarah had been engineering through 3 minutes of careful psychological manipulation. The young man's confusion was visible from 20 feet away, as his initial commitment to rescue his companions now conflicted with the obvious reality that their carefully planned robbery had become a nightmare scenario none of them had anticipated or prepared for. "Smart choice, Marcus," Sarah acknowledged, maintaining her control over the leader while keeping visual contact with all remaining threats. "Jimmy, that tire iron isn't going to change the math here. Look at Tony on the ground. Look at your boss barely conscious against this concrete barrier. You really want to be next?" Her voice carried the kind of professional calm that came from managing life or death situations as routine military operations, and it had the desired psychological effect on both remaining opponents. The leader attempted another weak struggle, but Sarah's positioning and leverage made resistance futile while potentially increasing his injury severity. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he gasped, though his words carried more desperation than authority. Street criminals were accustomed to victims who fought back with desperation and fear, not professional competence that neutralized superior numbers through tactical superiority and training. Jimmy came to a complete stop about 12 feet from Sarah's position, tire iron still raised but his body language showing increasing uncertainty. "What do we do, Marcus? We can't just leave Deacon like this." The use of the leader's street name provided Sarah with additional intelligence about their group dynamics and probable criminal backgrounds. More importantly, Jimmy's question revealed that group cohesion was fracturing under pressure exactly as she'd intended. Deacon made his choices when he decided to target someone in a community center parking lot, Sarah replied, allowing cold satisfaction to color her tone.
Just like Tony made his choice when he thought he could intimidate a woman walking to her car. Just like you're about to make your choice about whether you walk away from this or join them on the ground. Military training had taught her that psychological pressure often proved more effective than physical force in achieving tactical objectives. Marcus had now backed away to approximately 15 feet, pistol lowered but still in hand, clearly struggling with conflicting impulses about abandoning his companions versus accepting additional risk through continued engagement. This was supposed to be simple, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Just a quick robbery, get some cash, nobody gets hurt. His words confirmed Sarah's assessment that they were experienced but not sophisticated criminals operating on assumptions that had proven catastrophically incorrect. The enforcer Tony began showing more signs of consciousness, attempting to push himself up from the asphalt despite obvious disorientation from head trauma. Sarah calculated that she had perhaps 30 seconds before he regained enough coherence to rejoin the fight, which would significantly complicate her tactical situation by adding another armed opponent to manage simultaneously. Military experience had taught her that wounded enemies often fought with desperate ferocity that made them more dangerous than uninjured opponents. "Here's your reality check," Sarah announced, addressing all three conscious members of their group while maintaining physical control over Deacon. "I'm Sarah Martinez, former Marine Force Reconnaissance, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 8 years active duty, specialized training in close quarters combat and hostile territory operations. You picked the wrong target tonight, gentlemen." The revelation of her military background was calculated psychological warfare, designed to explain her capabilities while introducing doubt about what additional skills she might possess. Jimmy's tire iron finally dropped from nerveless fingers as the implications of her words penetrated his decision-making process. Street criminals understood hierarchy and respected demonstrated competence, even when it worked against their interests. Sarah's combat performance had already proven that her claimed credentials weren't empty boasting, and the logical consequences of continuing to oppose military-trained resistance were becoming obvious to everyone present. "Marines," Marcus whispered, his pistol now hanging at his side as psychological defeat replaced tactical calculation. "Jesus, Deacon, you said she was just some social worker volunteer." The breakdown in confidence was spreading through their group like wildfire, exactly the kind of moral collapse that Sarah had been engineering since their first encounter. When criminals lost faith in their ability to control a situation, they typically chose flight over fight. Deacon's response was barely audible through his compromised position against the concrete barrier. "How was I supposed to know? She looked like every other bleeding heart do-gooder we've hit before." His admission revealed both their criminal methodology and their fundamental miscalculation about target selection. Community center volunteers typically offered minimal resistance to armed robbery, making Sarah's military background an unprecedented complication in their established criminal pattern. "You want to know the difference between military training and street fighting?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the instructional tone she used with at-risk youth but loaded with considerably more menacing implications. "Military training assumes every opponent is armed, dangerous, and willing to kill you. Street fighting assumes victims are too scared or too weak to fight back effectively." Guess which assumption just got 4 people in serious trouble tonight? Tony managed to push himself up to a sitting position, blood trickling from his ear where Sarah's key had penetrated. His eyes showed the glassy confusion of significant head trauma, but also the growing awareness that their situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of successful completion. "My head," he mumbled, touching the wound gingerly while trying to focus on the tactical situation around him. "Stay down, Tony," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You've got a probable concussion and possible internal bleeding. Moving around too much could make that significantly worse." The medical assessment was accurate based on her military first aid training, but it also served to reinforce her psychological dominance by demonstrating knowledge that exceeded typical civilian capabilities. Jimmy had now backed away to join Marcus at what they apparently considered a safe distance, though Sarah's demonstrated combat range made their positioning more psychological comfort than tactical reality. "So what happens now?" Jimmy asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone whose criminal worldview had been fundamentally disrupted. "Do you call the cops? Do we all just pretend this never happened?" The question highlighted the complex reality of their situation from a legal perspective. Sarah had used force that would certainly be considered justified under Arizona's self-defense statutes, but the aftermath involved multiple injured criminals who could potentially claim excessive force or file false reports about the encounter's circumstances. Military training had included legal briefings about civilian use of force, but the practical application remained complicated. "What happens now depends entirely on your choices over the next 60 seconds, Sarah replied, maintaining her control over Deacon while addressing the group's collective decision-making process. "You can walk away from this parking lot, get Tony some medical attention, and never come back to this community center again. Or you can try to continue this encounter and discover what other skills they taught me during 8 years of military service." Marcus had apparently reached his decision point, slowly placing his pistol on the ground and stepping away from it with his hands visible. "We're done," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of someone accepting tactical defeat. "Jimmy, help me get Tony to the car." "Deacon." He looked toward his leader with obvious conflict about abandoning him, but also clear recognition that continued resistance offered no realistic path to success. "Deacon stays with me until you're all off the property," Sarah specified, tightening her control slightly to emphasize the non-negotiable nature of this requirement. "Insurance policy to make sure nobody gets creative ideas about revenge or regrouping. Once you're gone and I'm satisfied you're not coming back, I'll release him and we can all move on with our lives." The psychological dynamics of the group continued to fracture as individual survival instincts overrode group loyalty. Jimmy moved toward Tony, clearly prioritizing medical assistance over continued confrontation. Marcus retrieved his pistol but kept it pointed away from Sarah while backing toward the parking lot exit. The criminal conspiracy that had seemed so confident 15 minutes earlier was dissolving under pressure from a single opponent they'd catastrophically underestimated. "This isn't over," Deacon wheezed, making what appeared to be his final attempt at psychological intimidation. Sarah's response was swift and decisive. She increased pressure on his carotid artery just enough to cause immediate lightheadedness without permanent damage, demonstrating that even his verbal resistance carried potential consequences. "Yes, it is," she replied calmly. "It's been over since you made the mistake of thinking a community center volunteer would be an easy target. Tonight you learned why some people choose social work after military service. Because we've already seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, and we don't appreciate being forced back into that mindset."
As Marcus and Jimmy helped Tony to his feet, the full scope of their tactical disaster became apparent to everyone in the parking lot. Tony required significant support to walk, his head injury affecting both balance and coordination in ways that suggested potential long-term consequences. Marcus kept glancing nervously toward Sarah and Deacon, clearly calculating whether any opportunity remained for salvaging their situation through renewed aggression. Jimmy appeared focused solely on medical concerns, supporting most of Tony's weight while murmuring reassurances about getting him to a hospital. "Move slowly toward your vehicle," Sarah instructed, maintaining her control over Deacon while tracking the movement of all three men with the kind of tactical awareness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. No sudden movements, no reaching for additional weapons, no attempts at coordination for renewed attack. "You've already learned what happens when you miscalculate my capabilities. Don't compound that error with additional poor decision-making." The group's vehicle turned out to be a dark-colored sedan parked near the community center's main entrance, approximately 60 yards from their current position. The distance would provide Sarah with time to assess their commitment to withdrawal while maintaining leverage through her control of their leader. More importantly, it would allow her to evaluate whether they possessed additional weapons or backup plans that hadn't yet been revealed during their confrontation. "You realize this doesn't end with us driving away," Deacon said through gritted teeth, apparently making one final attempt at psychological intimidation despite his completely compromised tactical position. People are going to ask questions about Tony's injuries. People are going to want answers about what happened here tonight. His words carried the implied threat of criminal retaliation or law enforcement complications, both of which represented legitimate concerns for Sarah's future security. Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that separated military training from civilian self-defense instruction. Deacon, you're absolutely right that people will ask questions. They'll ask Tony how he got a perforated ear and severe head trauma. They'll ask you about those fresh bruises and why you were found in a community center parking lot at midnight. They'll ask Marcus why he was carrying an unregistered firearm during the commission of felony robbery. The psychological pressure was precisely calibrated to highlight the legal vulnerabilities that criminal defendants faced when reporting encounters with law enforcement. Career criminals typically avoided police contact whenever possible, particularly when their activities included weapons violations and assault charges that carried significant prison sentences. Sarah's military training had included instruction on civilian legal frameworks, knowledge that proved immediately applicable to her current situation. Marcus paused in his progress toward the vehicle, apparently processing the legal implications of Sarah's analysis. She's right, Deacon. We report this. We're looking at armed robbery charges, assault with deadly weapons, conspiracy charges, plus whatever they find when they start investigating our backgrounds. His words confirmed Sarah's assessment that they were experienced criminals with existing legal vulnerabilities that made police involvement problematic for their interests. So what are you proposing? Jimmy asked, adjusting his grip on Tony while looking back towards Sarah with obvious uncertainty. We all just pretend this never happened. What about Tony's injuries? What about the fact that she could probably identify all of us if she wanted to? His questions highlighted the practical complications of mutual silence agreements between criminals and their intended victims. Sarah had anticipated these concerns and prepared responses that addressed both immediate tactical requirements and longer-term security considerations. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take Tony to an emergency room and tell them he fell down concrete stairs during a drinking incident. Head injuries from falls are common enough that medical staff won't ask detailed questions if the story is consistent. You're going to avoid this community center permanently, and you're going to avoid targeting social workers anywhere in Phoenix. The proposal offered face-saving withdrawal for the criminal group while establishing clear boundaries for future behavior. Military training had emphasized that successful conflict resolution often required providing opponents with acceptable alternatives to continued resistance, particularly when complete victory carried disproportionate costs for all parties involved. And if we don't agree to your terms? Deacon asked, though his voice lacked the conviction necessary to make the question an effective threat. His current position against the concrete barrier, combined with Sarah's demonstrated combat capabilities, made continued negotiation his only realistic option for avoiding additional injury or legal complications. Then I call 911 right now and report an attempted armed robbery. Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Phoenix police respond to this location, find 3 injured criminals and 1 trained witness with military credentials and extensive documentation of community service. Guess how that legal proceeding turns out for everyone involved? The threat was credible because it accurately reflected the likely outcome of law enforcement investigation into their encounter. Tony's condition appeared to be stabilizing somewhat, though he still required significant support to maintain upright posture. Just agree to her terms, he said weakly. I need medical attention, and I don't need felony charges on top of whatever damage she did to my head. His practical assessment of their situation reflected the kind of cost-benefit analysis that typically governed criminal decision-making when confronted with superior force. Marcus and Jimmy had reached the approximate halfway point to their vehicle, close enough now that Sarah could begin calculating release procedures for Deacon that would minimize risk of renewed confrontation. Military training had emphasized that tactical disengagement required as much planning and precision as initial engagement, particularly when dealing with opponents who retained potential for future retaliation. Final terms, Sarah announced, addressing the entire group while preparing for the most dangerous phase of their encounter. The moment when she would have to release her primary leverage while trusting that their commitment to withdrawal was genuine rather than tactical deception. Sarah's tactical assessment of the disengagement process focused on the critical 15 seconds when she would transition from controlling Deacon to complete separation from all four criminals. Military training had emphasized that withdrawal from hostile contact often proved more dangerous than initial engagement, particularly when dealing with opponents who retained weapons and motivation for retaliation. Her positioning, timing, and psychological preparation would determine whether this encounter ended with mutual withdrawal or escalated into renewed violence. Marcus, Jimmy, continue to your vehicle but don't start the engine until I signal, Sarah commanded, maintaining her professional tone while calculating angles and distances for defensive movement. Tony gets in the passenger seat where he can receive immediate medical attention. Marcus drives, Jimmy rides in back. Everyone keeps their hands visible through the windows. Any deviation from these instructions, any attempt at tactical repositioning, any sudden movements, and this situation becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved. The three men complied with visible reluctance, their body language showing the psychological tension between accepting defeat and maintaining some semblance of criminal dignity. Marcus kept glancing back toward Deacon and Sarah, clearly struggling with abandoning his leader but also recognizing that further resistance offered no realistic path to success. Jimmy remained focused on supporting Tony, whose condition continued to show signs of serious head trauma that required professional medical intervention. When I release you, Deacon, you're going to walk directly to that vehicle without looking back, without making threats, without any attempts at dramatic final statements, Sarah specified, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. You get in the back seat next to Jimmy, Marcus drives you away from this property, and none of you return to this community center under any circumstances. Understood? Deacon's response came through gritted teeth, his pride clearly damaged by the tactical humiliation he'd experienced over the past 10 minutes. You think this makes you some kind of hero? You think beating up criminals in parking lots makes you better than the system that created us? His words carried the bitter resentment of someone whose worldview had been violently disrupted by encountering resistance he hadn't anticipated or prepared for. I think it makes me someone who refuses to be a victim, Sarah replied calmly. I think it makes me someone who uses military training to protect herself and others when criminals make poor target selection decisions. What it doesn't make me is someone who enjoys violence or seeks out confrontation. Tonight was your choice, Deacon. Every single consequence you're experiencing resulted from decisions you and your team made. The psychological dynamic between them had shifted completely from their initial encounter. Deacon's earlier confidence and authority had been replaced by the defensive anger of someone forced to confront the consequences of tactical miscalculation. Sarah's apparent vulnerability had revealed itself as professional competence that exceeded his criminal experience by several orders of magnitude. Marcus, Jimmy, and Tony had reached their vehicle and were positioning themselves according to Sarah's instructions. The sedan's interior light revealed additional details about their criminal operation: scanning equipment that suggested credit card fraud, various tools that could be used for breaking and entering, and what appeared to be additional weapons secured in a lockbox behind the driver's seat. Their community center robbery had apparently been one component of a broader criminal enterprise. Time to go, Deacon, Sarah announced, beginning the carefully choreographed release procedure she'd been planning since gaining control of him. Remember that I can identify all four of you. I know your vehicle description and license plate number, and I have sufficient military training to track down anyone who decides that revenge sounds like an attractive option. Make smart choices about your future decision-making. She released pressure on his carotid artery while simultaneously stepping backward and to the side, creating distance while maintaining visual contact and ready positioning for renewed defensive action. Deacon remained against the concrete barrier for several seconds, apparently assessing whether any tactical opportunities remained for salvaging the encounter through surprise attack or renewed aggression. This isn't over, he said finally, pushing himself away from the concrete and beginning his walk toward the vehicle. His words carried the predictable bravado of someone attempting to maintain psychological dignity after tactical defeat, but his body language showed no indication of immediate renewed threat. The statement was face-saving theater rather than credible tactical planning. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied with absolute finality. "It's been over since you made the fundamental error of assuming that community volunteers are automatically easy targets. Tonight you learned why some social workers have military backgrounds, and why criminal target selection requires better intelligence than you possessed." Deacon's walk to the vehicle took approximately 40 seconds, during which Sarah maintained tactical awareness of all potential threats while preparing for immediate defensive or offensive action if the situation deteriorated. Her positioning provided multiple escape routes while keeping the building entrance accessible if she needed to summon additional help or take cover from potential weapons fire. The car doors slammed shut with sounds that echoed across the quiet parking lot, marking the end of active confrontation but not necessarily the end of potential danger. Sarah's military training reminded her that tactical withdrawal often represented preparation for renewed engagement rather than genuine abandonment of hostile objectives. The sedan's engine started with a mechanical rumble that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert night silence, its headlights cutting through the darkness as Marcus slowly drove toward the community center's main exit. Sarah maintained her defensive positioning until the vehicle disappeared completely from sight, then waited an additional 3 minutes to ensure they weren't circling back for renewed engagement or establishing surveillance positions for future retaliation. Military training had emphasized that premature relaxation after hostile contact often proved more dangerous than the initial confrontation itself. Only after confirming their complete departure did Sarah allow herself to process the adrenaline crash and psychological after-effects of the encounter. Her hands remained steady. Years of military service had conditioned her nervous system to manage combat stress effectively, but her mind began cataloging the implications of what had just occurred. 4 career criminals now knew her identity, her capabilities, and her connection to the Sunrise Community Center. The tactical victory was complete, but the strategic consequences would require careful management. Sarah retrieved the knife that Deacon had dropped during their confrontation, using a tissue to avoid contaminating potential fingerprint evidence while securing it in her backpack. The weapon would provide law enforcement with additional evidence if future incidents required police involvement, and its removal from the scene eliminated potential use by other criminals who might discover it. Military training had included instruction on evidence preservation and crime scene management, knowledge that proved immediately applicable to civilian situations. Her Honda Civic remained undisturbed where she'd parked it under the streetlight, though Sarah conducted a thorough inspection for tracking devices, surveillance equipment, or sabotage before approaching the vehicle. Criminal organizations sometimes employed sophisticated techniques for monitoring targets, and her demonstrated combat capabilities might motivate more elaborate preparation for future encounters. The inspection revealed no tampering, confirming that their criminal operation had been relatively unsophisticated despite its coordination and planning. As she drove home through Phoenix's empty late-night streets, Sarah reflected on the encounter's broader implications for her civilian life and professional responsibilities. The community center served vulnerable populations who depended on its programs and services, making it a potential target for criminal retaliation against her personally. Her military background, while providing tactical advantages in dangerous situations, also carried responsibilities for protecting others who might be affected by consequences of her actions. The legal framework surrounding her use of force was clearly justified under Arizona self-defense statutes, but Sarah understood that criminal complaints could still create complications for her employment and volunteer work. Social service organizations typically preferred staff members who avoided violent confrontations, even when those confrontations resulted from criminal attacks rather than aggressive behavior. The practical politics of nonprofit administration might require careful explanation of tonight's events. Her apartment in Tempe welcomed her with the familiar comfort of civilian normalcy: houseplants that needed watering, mail that required sorting, and the peaceful routine of someone whose biggest daily challenges typically involve bureaucratic paperwork rather than life or death combat.
The transition from military to civilian life had taken several years, but encounters like tonight reminded her that some skills and instincts remain permanently embedded regardless of environmental changes. Sarah's reflection on the evening's events revealed both satisfaction with the tactical outcome and concern about potential long-term consequences. 4 criminals had learned that their target selection methodology contained dangerous assumptions about victim vulnerability. Community center volunteers weren't automatically easy marks. Social workers might possess military training, and apparent weakness could mask professional competence that exceeded criminal experience by several orders of magnitude. The broader implications extended beyond personal security to questions about civilian preparation for criminal violence. Sarah's military background provided capabilities that most community volunteers lacked, but basic self-defense training and situational awareness could significantly improve survival odds for anyone targeted by criminal predators. Her youth programs at the community center emphasized these skills, though tonight's encounter demonstrated their real-world application more dramatically than any classroom instruction. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah made mental notes about security improvements for the community center that would reduce vulnerability for other staff members and volunteers. Better lighting, security cameras, communication procedures, and coordination with local law enforcement could create deterrent effects that prevented future criminal targeting. Her military experience provided frameworks for threat assessment and protective planning that could benefit the entire organization. The final irony wasn't lost on her as she reviewed the evening's events one last time before sleep. She'd left military service seeking peaceful contribution to civilian society through social work and community service. Tonight had required her to demonstrate that peaceful intentions didn't preclude defensive capabilities, and that some predators only understood language spoken through decisive action rather than words. 4 criminals had cornered what they thought was an easy target in a Phoenix Community Center parking lot. 45 seconds later, they learned why former Marine Force reconnaissance operators are called Ghost, and why some mistakes carry permanent educational value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.